This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 39. Welcome to the 39th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. If you've been enjoying the show, I would absolutely love it if you would take a moment and leave a review and a rating on iTunes. This, of course, helps the show to move up in rankings so more people can find it. And I'd like to say a special thank you to all the listeners who've left reviews already. I recently figured out how to actually see all the reviews from all of the different countries, and I was just floored at all of the wonderful responses. So thank you so much. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please stop by the show notes page and leave a comment. So you'll find all the episodes at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. And I've also recently created the Fertility Friday Facebook group, which is a community of women that I'm slowly building, and with the hope that we'll be able to build a thriving and supportive community of like-minded women on their journey to learn fertility awareness charting and learn more about it. And so just go to fertilityfriday.com/community and you'll be redirected to the group. And today I'm joined by Dr. Melanie Davis. Dr. Davis began working in the field of sexuality education in 1984 when she became a Planned Parenthood patient educator. And she has recently created and facilitated numerous workshops in the area of sexuality and sexuality education. Her work in these areas led her to pursue her Master's of Education and her PhD in this field, and her mission is to help people learn and enjoy sexuality. She currently consults privately with individuals and couples at the New Jersey Center for Sexual Wellness, and she also provides professional development and facilitates presentations for medical health professionals. So as you can see, Dr. Davis has had an amazing career in the field of sexuality education, and in today's show we'll be talking about the importance of learning accurate information about sexuality from a young age, and what are some of the most common challenges that women and couples face in the area of sexuality. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Melanie.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. So although I did give you a short introduction, I'm sure it doesn't do justice because I was reading through your bio when I was preparing for the interview. So I'd love for you to walk us through how you entered the field of sexuality education, what inspired you, and what inspired you to actually make this into your career.
Sure. Well, actually, I started out in marketing. I had a 25-year career as a self-employed marketing consultant, but along the way, I was working or volunteering at Planned Parenthood. So that was always an interest of mine. And I became trained to facilitate a program called Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education that is produced by the Unitarian Universalist Association and the United Church of Christ. So I did that for a number of years, and the parents would say, thank God you're talking to our kids about sex so that we don't have to. And I said, no, that's not the way it's supposed to work. We're here to supplement the conversations that you have with your children. So to help facilitate that, I started offering workshops through parent-teacher associations and moms clubs and other kinds of community groups on how to talk with children about sexuality. And I really thought, gee, this is kind of more interesting than doing marketing. Maybe I can make a career out of this. So I entered the Widener University master's degree program in sexuality education, and very shortly decided, this is going to be my life. I love being a sexuality educator. So I transferred into the doctoral program, and part of that thinking was that I did want to work with the medical community and help physicians and nurses talk more comfortably about sexuality with their patients. And so I do that. I do training for healthcare professionals and education professionals. I also work part-time for the Unitarian Universalist Association, managing their Our Whole Lives program. So it's been a real circle that's taken me there. And in fact, that's a lifespan curriculum, and now I'm writing the final section of it, which is Our Whole Lives for older adults, ages 50 and above.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about how sexuality changes with age. And when I was doing my research for today's podcast, I noticed that when you did your PhD, your dissertation was entitled well, it's a long title, but Sexuality Education as Perceived by Physicians and Therapists, and it was an assessment of attitudes about an interest in referring patients to sexuality educators. So I guess I just wanted to ask you, what did you find when you actually assessed the attitudes about referring patients? I thought that was a very interesting topic that you chose to do your dissertation on.
Sure, probably one of the least sexy topics you can have for a human sexuality PhD dissertation. What I found was that what I studied nationwide marriage and family therapists, and found that there about 75% of them are willing to or would even consider referring their clients to a sexuality educator, and that correlated to the fact that they felt they were adequately trained to do that themselves. So that makes sense that they wouldn't refer out. Although the reason I picked marriage and family therapists was that, unlike sex therapists, marriage and family therapists are only take like one class in sexuality. So unless they do training after they graduate, they may or may not be the best source for information on sexuality. Then I also studied physicians in my local hospital. I would have loved to do a national study, but I frankly couldn't afford to buy the mailing list. And what I found was that their percentages of willingness to refer patients to a sexuality educator was in the 90 percentile, because they're not trained to talk about sex and they're willing to admit that. So the people what was interesting, the people who are most likely to refer are gynecologists, internal medicine specialists, adolescent medicine specialists were happy to do it. Surgeons were the group that was the most likely to refer patients for sex ed, which makes sense because if you're cutting off body parts and fixing hips and knees and whatnot, they ought to be doing that. What the problem all of them faced was they didn't know how to find us.
Oh,
There
okay.
are not many sex educators in private practice. So, we need to kind of boost that as a profession, and that was one of the recommendations that I made in my dissertation, was that the field make an effort to create knowledge that there's a need there. And just so your audience knows how you can find a certified sexuality educator, there's an organization called the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And the website is aasect.org, asect.org. And you can go online and find certified sexuality educators and certified therapists and counselors.
Okay, that's great. One of the topics that I want to talk about, of course, is why sex education is important. And when I was thinking about this question, the other day I was talking to my husband and he works with youth. And he was talking about a question that he had from a youth because he had a youth who was actually honestly asking if she could get pregnant from having oral sex, so from swallowing
Mm-hmm.
semen.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, when he was asking the question, he was kind of like, duh, how, yeah, would you not? But I said, well, that's exactly why sex education is important. There are no stupid questions. Some people,
Sure.
there's a time when none of us knew the answer to any of those questions. So maybe you could talk about why it's actually important and your views on doing it at a young age, adolescents and
Sure.
teenagers.
Well, actually, my first exposure to being a sexuality educator was when I worked at Planned Parenthood, and my role was to have the first conversation with the patients, who were mostly girls. Sometimes they brought a partner in, and so I was supposed to talk about reproduction, how it happens, and how people get pregnant, and then I had this whole list of myths that I was supposed to address so that they knew what not to do in the future. And that included, you standing up when you have sex does not prevent pregnancy. Douching with soda pop after sex does not. And the first time I read this list, I was floored, thinking, well, duh, who doesn't know this? But then I realized that the reason they had this list of myths was that these are things that girls actually came in thinking. And so my job was to debunk that. So, a lot of parents count on schools to provide sexuality education, But of course, if you live in a state or a country that has sort of this abstinence only mindset, the attitude is if everybody just keeps their legs closed, we won't have any pregnancy. But the problem is what the research shows us is that people, for example, who take a pledge, the silver ring thing or whatever their pledge happens to be abstinent, only abstain for an additional 18 months. And then when they become sexually active, they're more likely to get sexually transmitted infections or to get pregnant because they haven't had the education in how to protect themselves. So, the wise course is to do something like comprehensive sexuality education, which gives them all the facts and says, look, it's better to wait. But if you don't wait, here's how to protect yourself. Now, you said something about when sex ed should start, and you mentioned adolescence. I would argue that sex ed starts the minute a baby is born.
Mm-hmm.
That when we start talking to a baby and changing its diapers and naming its body parts, and if a baby gets a little older and starts grabbing its genitals, the way we respond to those things is sexuality education. So if we say, oh, push your hand away, don't touch that pee pee, that's dirty, that's dirty, well, then a child is learning that there's something wrong with their body. So, we can really start shaping attitudes about bodies and where it's appropriate to touch, private places versus public places. That can start very early on.
And how do you respond to parents who believe that sex education at a young age will corrupt their children or destroy their innocence? So this question is coming because I live in Ontario, and so recently the Ontario curriculum, sex ed curriculum, was adapted to include consent, to include the definitions of different types of sexual acts, including oral sex and anal sex. I don't know all of the specific details, so please don't quote me on this, but there were specific changes that were made to make it more definitive.
Hmm.
And there were parents picketing. And so, and then also there's a lot of, I've heard a lot of different things from parents, even with regards to naming of, calling a penis, calling testicles testicles. And I did a 2 podcast series about sexual abuse and the ramifications for not actually giving your child the language to describe anything that's happening to them. But how do you respond to kind of concerned parents thinking that this is going to destroy their children's innocence?
Right. Well, I don't think information destroys innocence. I think what destroys innocence is having things that you see and observe or maybe experience without being able to put them in context. For example, if you're, I don't know about Ontario, but down here in the States, when we have grocery store aisles, all those tabloid magazines and the, men's fitness and self magazines and all those are right there when you check out. So your kids are going to see them. So, without having any context, they're just seeing a lot of half naked people and sexualized images. And what do they make of that? The other thing is that we've got, kids looking at porn. The average age for boys is around 10 years old, that they're looking at internet porn. Girls are a little later, but they look at it also, not always willingly. Sometimes they accidentally happen upon it, but they're seeing these things. So they're not innocent. What we can do is help them understand this is this is a commercial product for adult entertainment. That's not for you to be watching. We can say to those magazines, yeah, they're portraying those people, they're laughing at those people's bodies, but I don't like that because I think everybody has a right to be beautiful and feel good in their skin no matter what they look at. We have all sorts of opportunities to provide education, and that's our obligation, I think, as parents, is to make meaning of these things for our children. Yeah, the sex education that they get in school should be the least amount of education they get. They should be getting most of their education from mom and dad, or mom and mom, or dad and dad, whoever's in the house. But that's where they should be getting their education. There are plenty of books that people could get, but just the daily conversations are just so important.
All those teachable moments that
Absolutely.
always come up. And so, in what ways have you supported nervous parents? Because obviously, we're all human beings, and I would say, most of us didn't grow up in a house where it was really open, talk about sex. I think I could say that. I think that's a fair statement. I think most of it, because I know, I mean, my parents made a good effort, but it still wasn't completely open. I still had to go about my education in other ways. Like I've mentioned before, I listened to the Sunday Night Sex Show. I moved out on my own when I went to university, bought a few books about sex so that I could learn more because I wanted to educate myself. And so, how, in what ways have you supported nervous parents in having these types of ongoing conversations with their children and their teenagers? And
Well, one way is very casual. Once people hear what I do for a living, they just spill their guts and start asking all these questions. So, you know, they're, I never get tired of it. Somebody asked me recently, don't you ever get tired about talking about sex all day? And I said, well, I would if all I talked about was sexual behavior, but that's the least of it. Most of it is our attitudes about sexuality and how to be more comfortable and how to communicate. And a very small part of it is the actual sex behaviors themselves. When I do parent programs, so some of them are community groups invite me in. Some of them are individuals will say, I've got a group of 10 friends and we'd like to bring you in and have a private sexuality education consult. So it's kind of like a 90-minute party to talk about how to talk about sex with your kids. Also, through my work with the Unitarian Universalist Association, our curriculum, it goes kindergarten through first grade, grades 4 to 6, grades 7 to 9, grades 10 to 12, young adult and adult. And then, like I said, I'm working on older adult. But all the ones for the young people require parents to attend a very lengthy orientation before they can sign the permission slip for their children to take this class. And that's because we want the parents to know what we're going to be teaching in the curriculum so that they can support that at home and we can support them in their role as primary sexuality educators of their children. And actually, we are field testing this fall, in fall 2015, a new curriculum called Parents as Sexuality Educators. And that'll be an 11 session class that they learn what kinds of conversations their young people need to have. And they get to role play having those tough conversations before they actually have to have them with their children.
I think that that's such a great approach because obviously, unless you've taken a class or unless you've become educated in this area, just because you have sex doesn't mean that you have the ability to be a sexuality educator. There's a
Sure.
lot of things that your average person may not know or may not know accurately.
But the thing is that parents, first of all, if anybody has access to the internet, they can look most things up. There are some sites that are definitely better than others. There's a great one, Advocates for Youth is a great resource for parents. Scarletine is a great one for young people. There's a lot of great places to look up information. Even WebMD has good stuff. And there's a I can't remember there's a great one in Canada that I can't remember the name of, but it's a great source. So parents can look things up and you don't have to be an expert. It's okay to say, "Geez, that's a great question. What do you think the answer is?" And let your child tell you what they've heard. Maybe you can recognize the misinformation, and then you can say, I'm interested in getting a more complete answer, so let me get back to you tomorrow. I'll do some research. People who don't have access to the internet probably have access to a library where they can look things up. They can go to the bookstore and they don't necessarily even have to buy the book. They can just look up the answer. And they can call the pediatrician and get some answers that way. So there are a lot of ways to find out information without being a professional sex educator.
I think that's a great point too, because that kind of takes the edge off of that feeling of needing to know all the answers. So I
Hmm.
like the way that you address that. And so when you're working with teens, what are some of the most common questions that you get or something things that you wouldn't necessarily expect?
Well, every teen is different, and some young people will never ask a question.
Yeah.
And so the parents have to look for opportunities to provide information. And I always say, really small doses, like the length of a TV commercial, you know, make a comment, let it go, and you're putting it out there. No teenager wants to hear a 10-minute exposition on reproduction. But you can do things, for example, like if you're watching television and there's a couple that, there's a joke about hopping into bed, or they're, actually hopping into bed. My daughters, I have three daughters, they're all adults now, but they got so sick of me saying, "Excuse me, did I hear anybody talking about condoms? Did I hear anybody talking about mutual expectations?" I mean, they got so that they could actually, the minute I said, "Excuse me," they say, "Did somebody talk about condoms?" But, I mean, it's just, like you said it before, a teachable moment. Mostly, uh, mostly kids want to know that they're normal, that their bodies are normal, that their discharges, whether they're wet dreams or vaginal discharge, that's normal. So that normalcy, wanting to feel normal, is a really important thing. Um, these days, a lot of young people are exploring their gender and their orientation. And it's not that they didn't do it before; it's just they didn't have the language for it necessarily. So now they're hearing words like genderqueer and transgender and asexual and bisexual, and sometimes they're exploring who they are. And it helps for them to know that they will be loved regardless of whether they're straight or gay or asexual or transgender. They need that security of knowing that their family's love is unconditional, and not, "I love you even though you're gay," or "I love you even though you're straight, but I love you because you're you in, all your fascinating explorations."
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful approach. I think it's challenging for parents. Everyone has different beliefs and views, but I think the most important thing is for children to know that their parents love them, obviously.
Absolutely. And another thing that parents can do that schools can't is parents can share family values and spiritual values about sexuality. The curriculum that I work on, the Our Whole Lives curriculum, is a secular curriculum. So it has its own set of values: self-worth, responsibility, sexual health, justice and inclusivity. Those are values, but they're secular values. When we use it in our congregations, we add another manual called Sexuality in Our Faith, so that families know that their children are getting this added, the Unitarian Universalist or the United Church of Christ values around sexuality. If parents don't have access to a curriculum like that, they can still, they give their kids a book. They can say, "The reason I'm giving you this book, and the reason I've chosen this particular book, is because it aligns with your co-parent or my values about sexuality, and these are the things that we want to share with you."
Yeah, I think that's one of the fears that a lot of those picketing parents had is that, you're teaching values, right, about sex to my child, and like you said, it's the parents' job, it's the family's job to impart that on their children, which is why it's so important for parents to talk to their children about sex, to impart those values and beliefs.
Well, one of the things about comprehensive sexuality education, in whatever form you get it, is that we do know through research that more information does not trigger sexual activity at an earlier age. Indeed, it does the opposite. And I think you can fairly argue that, somebody who doesn't know what oral sex is may easily be talked into it. But if they knew what it was, then they could really decide ahead of time, is this something that I have any interest in participating in? And if I do, under what circumstances? Would I be doing this just because a partner asked me to? Or is this something that I'm really curious about and wanting to do for myself and I can do it in a safer way? If they don't have that information, it's very easy for them to be coerced into doing something that they don't want to do, or to just, even if they want to do it, to be able to stop for a minute and say, I know my body is telling me, go, go, go. But I also know that no harm is going to come to me from saying no and giving myself more time to think about this.
Hmm. I think that's such a good point because uh, I think youth are often discounted. You know, they're just impulsive, they're just ruled by their hormones and the changes in puberty and everything. But you're right in that if you have the information, you can think about it ahead of time. And if you don't, then you just end up in a situation with no roadmap, with no like it's a I always love to use the analogy of like driving a car, you know, we have to take a test and
Hmm.
learn, do driver's training and then, practice and but with sex you just throwing kids out there without a manual and obviously people are going to
Absolutely.
make mistakes. I mean it's at least if you're giving the information, and it's safe to say that at some point in everyone's life, most people have sex. At some point. It doesn't have to be today, but at some point. So eventually, we all need this knowledge.
Absolutely. Another thing that I encourage parents to do, and this kind of makes them a little squeamish, is to talk about the different kinds of sexual behavior as a continuum, because often young people think that it's either all or nothing. If they're interested in somebody and somebody starts touching them, then it's either they have to shut down completely or they have to go for intercourse or some kind of penetrative activity. And so I'll tell parents, can you talk to your kids about petting and how exciting that can be, to just kiss somebody and hold them and rub bodies together? There's, virtually no risk involved with body rubbing. If, you got your clothes on, it feels hot and exciting, and it's a good way for teenagers to, relieve some of that sexual tension without risk. And then, of course, partnered with that is talking about masturbation as a normal, healthy way to relieve sexual tension. So, you're kind of empowering your child, your teen, to explore their sexuality in ways that are responsible and also pleasurable, but that aren't going to get them into any kind of risky behaviors.
Hmm. Yeah, I could see that being an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of parents, but an
Sure.
important one. So, one of the things I wanted to talk about as well, to kind of shift gears a little bit,
Hmm.
was the dynamics of sexuality between couples and how it changes as a couple remains together, for example, for for many years. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that. And I know you work a lot with couples as well as individuals, but maybe we could start by talking a little bit about what are some of the common reasons that couples come to you? What are some of the factors that bring people into your office?
Yeah. So, one of the things is I'm a sexuality educator, not a therapist. So, whereas a therapist gets into the psychological issues that couples, maybe infidelity, significant lack of desire, erectile function problems, real identity issues, real psychological stuff. As an educator, I work in the realm of knowledge and skills. So if a couple has, if I get a phone call and a couple just says, we're just not having sex as often as we used to have it, we'd like to have sex more often, I'll ask a couple screening questions. And if it seems like they're just bored or haven't made sex a priority, that's an educational thing. If it seems like they have deeper issues going on or issues that I can't really screen carefully on the phone, then I refer them to a sex therapist that I work with at the New Jersey Center for Sexual Wellness. I'm very careful about boundaries.
Hmm.
So, in terms of the sexuality education that people come to me for, most of the people that I see are female. The referrals tend to come from their gynecologists or their general practitioners. Very often it's things, and women at any age, they haven't experienced an orgasm and they're curious about how to do that. Sometimes they're being treated for sexual pain and they want to figure out how to be intimate with a partner while their normal parts that they work with, their vulva or their vagina, are kind of off limits because they're not in working order at the moment. How can they still be intimate with their partner? I've had a guy come one time. He had a lot of first time partners and no repeats.
Hmm.
And he was trying to figure out why. Now, the way I work is I work in a medical office and there's no hands-on contact. Nobody takes their clothes off. It's simply a conversation and I may refer them to books or videos or toys or other kinds of specialists. I may give them some homework and then they'll come back and talk about how that went. But I am not a surrogate. There's no,
Yeah,
so when we talk about, how can this guy have a better luck next time? It's not like
you're going to
I,
demonstrate.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, the surrogate one, and there that's not even legal in a lot of states. Although there can be occasions when that can be a valuable tool in sex therapy, but that's not the realm that I work in. I've had couples who were just trying to figure out what lube would work best for them. So people come for all different reasons, but I would say the primary reason relates to orgasm. I had one couple come in, they were polyamorous and there was a married couple and I was meeting with the husband and his partner and they wanted their sex life to be more creative. And it was interesting because I wasn't working with the wife, I was working with, it was an interesting dynamic. I suspect there will be more of that kind of thing in the future as more people explore open relationships. With the orgasms is interesting because there are women who are, when we talk enough about the topic, it seems that they actually are having orgasms, but they don't recognize what they're having as an orgasm
Hmm.
because they've read the romance novels or they have seen movies of female friends who are talking about, fireworks and they saw God and, that was a transformational experience. And so they have really big expectations and they're not recognizing the small, lovely, gentle orgasms that they're having. And if you don't recognize those, you're not mindful of how to make that even more pleasurable because you're just saying, oh, that's just nothing. So part of my work is helping women understand what their bodies are doing, understand their anatomy. Sometimes they don't realize, and most times men and women don't realize that basically 75% of women do not orgasm through vaginal penetration alone. Their vulvar anatomy is such that when you're having penetrative sex, there's no stimulation of the clitoris, and most women need direct stimulation of the clitoris. So once I show them some illustrations of sexual anatomy and explain to them how, there are certain positions that will increase the stimulation of that area. But for the most part, you need a hand or a vibrator or a mouth or something, or rubbing against a partner's body to get off. And that's like this huge weight that gets lifted off their shoulders and off their partner's shoulders because it's like their partner's like, I could keep it up for an hour and it wouldn't be enough. Well, you're right, because you're not hitting the right spot. um, I had one woman who stopped herself from having orgasms because she thought that every time wet the bed,
Mm.
and we deduced that actually what she was doing was ejaculating. And that, if it bothers you, put a towel on the bed, but enjoy the process. That's what your body does. Not all women's bodies respond that way, but some do. And there's nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. And, have in the shower if it really bothers you, but otherwise just enjoy it.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about female ejaculation. I remember when I was in university, I went to this sex talk, and it was kind of like the first time I was exposed to all these really cool topics. And we saw these really cool pictures of anatomy and saw how big the clitoris actually is because only part of it's out on the outside. And she talked a lot about female ejaculation and how it's real, how it's a thing, and how it's not pee. And so I
Right.
think that's a really common thing. As you mentioned in the beginning, we all want to feel normal. So if you don't, again, if you don't have that knowledge about what's going on, you can assume and be worried that there's something wrong with you. So maybe you could talk a little bit about female ejaculation and how it's different to pee.
Right. Well, so it's interesting that the women have these engorgeable tissue, if you will, that surrounds the urethra. And it has a couple different names: the paraurethral glands, the Skene's glands. The names like that don't really matter to most people. It's just engorgeable tissue, and what it engorges with is basically the same thing that men have, the prostatic fluid. Only, of course, women don't have a prostate, but it's salts and water and proteins and stuff. It doesn't have semen in it, of course, because women don't produce semen. But upon getting aroused, that tissue does tend to fill up, and if it's enough with fingers or a toy, or if you're in the right position, then a woman can basically release that fluid. It's called transudated through the tissues, and it comes out the urethra. Now, sometimes it's not noticeable. A woman will just think, "Oh, I had a really wet orgasm this time." Or she'll say, "Oh, my partner ejaculated inside of me," if she's straight. My partner ejaculated inside of me, and so that must be all the wetness that I'm feeling. So it's not always a lot. For some women, it's a significant, does feel kind of like a gush. In For the most part, in the pornography that shows women squirting and gushing, 3 feet away, that's urine or props, or some mechanism. It's not necessarily real. So for the most part, most women don't have to worry that they're going to squirt across the room if if that area of their body is stimulated. And and for some women, having that spot stimulated, it would be if you reach inside the vagina and stimulate the front wall, so the wall towards the belly button. And when someone is aroused, it starts to feel more like a little, like an almond, sort of. It feels different. But for some women, having that area stimulated is really annoying. It can almost feel painful, and it can feel like you have to urinate. In general, if you can hang out and move past that, then that sensation can actually be pretty pleasurable. But women have to learn how to really relax into that sensation. And if you're trying really hard, it's just like having an orgasm. If you're trying really hard to experience an orgasm, it's not going to happen because you're trying too hard. You have to relax into it and give yourself up to the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. Well, I would imagine that you've just blown some minds with that information. And I'm glad that you talked about the G spot so that we know where it is. What are some ways that sexuality changes as couples remain together for a while? Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that couples face in terms of keeping the magic alive, or as you said, sometimes couples come to you when they're bored or
Hmm.
just not having sex as frequently as maybe they'd like to.
Yeah, so at different phases of life, people have different challenges. And if you're a parent, clearly your responsibilities as a parent have to come before your sex life. So, if you've got a kid who's waking up every 2, 3 hours for a feeding, it's kind of hard to have the energy to also be sexual. Or if your kid's a little bit older, and they're constantly getting up because they're being potty trained. And then things don't necessarily get better because at a certain point, they're in high school and they're staying up all night. And when you used to be able to have some private time because the kids are asleep, Now they're up all night. And so you have other challenges to finding private time with a partner or even with yourself and a vibrator. So, often it's a case when there are issues like that of finding ways to have private time. And it might be getting creative about telling a friend, I really, really need an hour. Can you take my kids for an hour and I will do the favor back to you? Because if you lose contact entirely, it's not like you can say, kids are growing up, we'll have sex maybe once a month and that'll do it. And then, we'll get it together when the kids are out of the house. That doesn't work. I mean, you have to maintain a connection with your partner. And if you're frankly, often a lot of women who are primary caretakers will say, oh, I've got kids all over me all day. And the last thing I want is my partner all over me at night. So maybe you have to work at a deal that you get an hour to yourself where you get to take a shower or a bath or read a steamy novel or whatever recharges you. And then maybe you'll have the energy and the desire to be touched again. But finding ways to keep that intimacy alive. Maybe all you can get it together to do is snuggle on the couch while you're exhausted watching TV. But at least maybe that's a way of having some physical connection and intimacy. I know the realities are not everyone can afford a date night. Babysitters cost a fortune now, so that it can be difficult. But that just means you have to be extra creative about finding ways to keep that intimacy alive. There's always going to be a lot of stresses, and stress is a desire killer. If you're paying for your kids' college or your kids aren't in college, but they're living at home and they're dragging you down because they're not working. I mean, there's all sorts of worries that parents have. You have to make intimacy, the actual sexual behavior is important, but the emotional intimacy is even more important. So you can have a conversation about something other than the bills that you have to pay or the work that you're doing and try to remember what brought you together in the first place. As we get older, our hormones are changing. If you have a husband, your husband's body may be changing. Sometimes those physical changes in men start in the mid 40s, and they start freaking out because their ejaculation starts to get a little weaker, and their erections maybe not as reliable as they were before. Perfectly normal. Perfectly normal. But if you don't know that that's normal, you freak out. For women, perimenopause can start as young as 35, and your hormones start changing. And with it, your moods go up and down. Your periods change. So, the closer you get to menopause, it can seem like you got 3 periods a month, and you don't necessarily want to be having sex when you're having 3 periods a month. So, it can be very challenging, that midlife kind of period. So, it's worth investing in figuring out how to make this work. And maybe it's a date night, maybe it's a Sunday afternoon when the kids are at work. Whatever you can do to create that intimacy. And then as couples get older, sometimes they lose for women, the estrogen is dropping, for men, the testosterone is dropping. What we know from the research is that if you had a good sex life before your 50s and 60s, odds are good that you'll have a good sex life later in life. There's no reason for that to change. The sexual behavior itself may change, but the satisfaction level is actually sometimes higher for older adults than it is for younger adults because they have less embarrassment about their bodies. They know what they like, they know what works. They're more willing to tell a partner what they want. And all of that combined creates a more satisfying sex life.
Hmm. Well, I think it's interesting and important to talk about sexuality at different ages because, of course, in our culture, you had mentioned how, when you're walking through the grocery store, you see all these magazines. Well, most of the people in the magazine kind of look the same: young,
Hmm.
fit, skinny. And so we don't really think of, people as they age to still be sexual. And I think it's important to open those conversations because obviously I'm not going to just be a completely different human when I'm older.
Sure. And there's cross-cultural stuff too, for uh not every cultural group thinks that sex stops when you're older. So, depending on the culture that you grew up in or the race that you are, you might have different values about and expectations about sexuality when you're older. In terms of body image, there's an Instagram account that I just love called Love Your Lines, and it's women showing their stretch marks. They might have a droopy belly because they've had a couple babies, and it's like, my body is awesome. I put a kid in the world and my body shows the signs of that. And the sense of empowerment that this Instagram account has. And you don't see anybody's face. You don't see any vulvas or, crotch shots. It's just, pretty tasteful amateur pictures of stretch marks basically, and bellies. And it's the words that go with it that are, I think, really, really lovely, because when all you see is the photoshopped stuff, we very rarely see real bodies and the impact of parenthood and age and, sometimes illness or surgeries on our bodies. And wouldn't it be lovely if we sometimes saw a model that had an appendectomy scar, or, I fell off a bicycle when I was a kid and I've got this thing down my arm, and that can be beautiful too. It's just how we kind of frame the messages that we give ourselves. And sometimes as we age in particular, we're so hard on ourselves in terms of, I ought to get rid of this last 15 pounds, or, if only I had a tummy tuck, or if only I had a breast lift, or, if only my partner's body did X, Y, or Z, instead of focusing on the pleasure that we're still capable of having, and the beauty of a body that is capable of receiving and giving pleasure.
Yeah, I love what you said about that, because there's just this unrealistic beauty expectation. I think it's getting to be worse for men now, but I think the intense pressure is still on women. And
Hmm.
and it is unrealistic. And I love what you said about the stretch marks, meaning that you were able to bring a baby into the world. Or, uh, I mean, if you had a certain surgery, maybe that surgery saved your life. And so you have the scar, but unfortunately, there's that negative connotation with it. Instead of being able to kind of acknowledge what you've been through, and the fact that that is part of why you're here.
I do I do a talk often at Unitarian Universalist churches about one of our first principle is about honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And so my sermon in that, I talk about how we're pretty good about honoring other people's worth and dignity, but not necessarily our own. And so one of the things I do is talk about our scars, and how we tend to look at scars and imperfections as these terrible, terrible things, when actually they all have a story behind them. And, if you've got a cesarean section scar, or you've got a mastectomy scar, or, they're not imperfections. They are stories. And if we look at them that way, boy, does that change our perspective. I was thinking the other day about, how do you describe stretch marks? And, you know, they can kind of be like lightning bolts. And if you think about them that way, they always glow kind of silvery or coppery on your skin. And they can actually be kind of cool looking if you look at them that way, instead of, oh my gosh, I have all these stretch marks all over my body. Well, think of them as lightning bolts.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I love what you said, because your body tells a story.
Hmm.
So it's it's kind of like art in a way.
It absolutely, absolutely. And suppose somebody was with a new partner, and instead of being afraid of all the things that they perceive to be wrong with themselves, if they said, let's explore each other's bodies, and tell our stories as we explore each other's bodies. I mean, that could be a really erotic thing.
Yeah. Well, and such an interesting way to get to know somebody, to see the
Hmm.
physical aspect, because your body does tell a story. Any physical things that you've been through kind of show up right there in your body. It's like, yeah. So I love that perspective, and I'm really glad that you talked about that.
Thanks, thanks.
Well, I have a few questions to kind
Sure.
of bring our interview to an end today. So many things we could talk about.
Well, I can always come back.
Well, this is kind of a fun question, but I think we've touched on it quite a bit as well, but what are some of the ways that we can all have great sex? Some general things that we could all do to improve our sex lives or just to improve our enjoyment or our pleasure or just something along those lines.
Well, everyone's looking for a different kind of sexual experience. So in that regard, it's hard to generalize because somebody might like it quiet and slow and somebody might like it rough and loud. Um, Consent is the first thing, is that, if we know that we are only going to be asked to do things that we're really enthusiastic about, or at least that we're enthusiastic about trying, and we reserve the right to say, yeah, that's not for me. But consensual sex means that partners are equally on board with everything that's happening from start to finish. And so that means that, we tend to think about consent being an issue for single people, but it's an issue for partnered people as well. Because, while there's going to be times in any relationship that one partner wants it more than the other, and it's fine to engage in sex for your partner's benefit, as long as it's not always that kind of one-sided thing. But, there can be reciprocity, doesn't have to be every time you do it, everybody gets off the same. But but understanding that we have an agreement that we're both going to we're going to consent to anything that we do. That's the first thing. The other thing I think is not taking yourself so seriously. I had when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who we were talking about the internal condom, also called the female condom. And she was saying, well, that some people complain that it's noisy, but you know what? Good sex is noisy, and good sex makes you laugh. And you don't take it so seriously. And if you don't take it so seriously, then you can have the freedom to experiment and explore. And, people might burp, they might pass gas, they might make noises or be awkward or say, oh, my back is killing me, or this isn't going to work, my knees aren't going to hack it. It's important to be able to just lighten the heck up.
I think that's great advice because, of course, when you watch TV, it's always this magical, perfect, no condoms, no
Right.
discussion. Everyone is just so happy, and then it's over in 2 minutes, and everyone's fully satisfied. The end.
Right. And yeah, yeah. Um, and yeah, the other thing is that as we age, both men and women tend to need more direct and prolonged stimulation to get aroused. And women tend to need at least 20 minutes of play to get fully aroused so that then they're in a position to have an orgasm. That's not to say that a quickie can't be a really fun and exciting thing, but generally we need a little more time. So as we age, that time is going to increase is important. And then understanding as we age that it may be harder to experience orgasm. And sometimes, if you're in a relationship with a person with a penis and it's always been erect and it's always been sex to orgasm, and then age comes along and it's not always erect and it's not, then it can scare people. And in couples that stop having sex, usually it's the man who makes that decision not to have sex anymore, and usually it's because he's afraid that he's not going to be able to have or maintain an erection. And if people only knew, we don't have to be so goal oriented. We can think about the pleasure our bodies can give each other, our mouths can give each other. It doesn't matter if we have an orgasm, if we just enjoy each other's bodies for the sake of their enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. I think that it would be so helpful to kind of know what to expect as you get older, because uh, how would you know? I mean, you experience them and you don't know if they're normal or not. And so I think the education piece is so important, and the
Yeah.
communication piece around it as well.
So if I could, I'd like to give a plug for an organization. I'm the co-president of the Sexuality and Aging Consortium at Widener University. And people can read our blog at sexualityandaging.com. We also have a Facebook page. But what we do is our members provide education to both consumers, everyday people. We also provide professional development for people in the field who work with older adults, and also work with long-term care facilities on developing policies for the sexual rights of their residents. So, we welcome people who are not professionals to join us to just support the cause. There are also there's some good books out there. One of a really excellent author is Joan Price. She has some her one of her books is called Naked at Our Age, and she talks very, very openly and honestly about the things that can go wrong, and how to get pleasure and what kind of toys to use. And it's just a nice resource. And as I said, the curriculum that I work on for the Unitarian Universalist Association is offered at Unitarian Universalist congregations, at United Church of Christ congregations, and people can just buy the curriculum if they want and use it on their own in their own community groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
And I have two final rapid fire questions, I guess you could call them. So the first one is, what is one of the biggest myths about sex and sexuality that you would like to see corrected?
That everybody has an orgasm every time. As you alluded to, some of the hottest scenes in movies just wouldn't work in real life.
No.
And that doesn't mean you're having bad sex. It just needs, we need to be realistic about, what works in real life versus what works on the camera.
You mean everyone doesn't come simultaneously every time they have sex?
No, and simultaneous isn't necessarily the best thing either, because if you can focus on your partner's pleasure and then your partner can focus on yours, that can often be better than actually trying for this goal that somebody said was ideal.
Mm-hmm. And last question of the day. Is there any one thing that you wish every couple knew about sex before they even started their relationship?
Gosh, that it's important to talk, that sometimes communication is more important than what you actually do initially, because as long as you can speak openly, then you can talk about how to make things better. So, very often you might have room for improvement, let's say. And if you can't talk about it, then it just stays that way. But if you can open dialogue, and it's never too late to start dialogue. I mean, you can have a couple that's in their 50s or 60s that just starts having a conversation, and changing things and changing patterns. So it's never too late, but you do have to have a commitment to that open communication. And if you can't get that conversation started, then sex counselors, sex therapists can help with that. If you need help with knowledge and skills, then that's what sexuality educators are for.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a great note to end on. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I had a great time talking to you about all things sex.
Oh, this
Um,
was fun.
and you did give a few websites, but if any of our listeners want to contact you directly, maybe you could give them your information, how they can do
Sure.
that.
So my website is MelanieDavisPhD.com. And people can email me at answers@MelanieDavisPhD.com.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Melanie. I was so great having you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed my interview today with Dr. Melanie Davis. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You can find me on Twitter at Fertile Friday, or stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes for today's episode, which you'll find at fertilityfriday.com/39, so the number 39. You can find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook fan page, which you'll find at facebook.com/fertilityfridays with an S. And you can also find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook group, which you'll find at fertilityfriday.com/community, and you'll be redirected to the group. And of course, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. I read all the reviews, and I really appreciate all of you for leaving reviews so far. I'm just thrilled to see all the amazing feedback that I've had from all of you. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.